All right. Hey guys. I'm sure everyone already read. Should I call you Dr. Leith?
No, I'm
Mr.
Sam.
Leith, Mr. Leith, or Sam. I'm sure everyone already read Sam's wiki page, but I'm just going to remind everyone of about some of the things. So most of us already read the book "You're Talking to Me" in Italian. And I think most of us also read the book we're going to talk about today, which is right to the point. Sam was educated in Eton and Oxford, so wow. And the first question would be, what do you think are the three best or the three most important things a new author should know, or a writer should know, or think about?
Well, that's a very good question. Three things. Well, the number one thing, which goes to the heart of this book and also connects it to the previous book about rhetoric, because they sort of come as a pair, is thinking about the audience. I mean, there are various ways of framing this. The one I used in the rhetoric book is a saying that's attributed, I think, to Mark Twain, saying when you go fishing, you bait the fish with what you bait the hook with what the fish likes, not with what you like. And or it's not what you say, it's what people hear. So you're always trying to think as a writer, and this informs everything from your vocabulary choice to your choice of genre to your whole approach, your metaphors, your references, the quotes you use. Is this thing in rhetoric it's called ethos, which is the speaker's connection with his or her audience. And when you're writing, I think it's massively important to know, we've all got to know what your audience is, what they need to know, what they don't know, what they already know, what they're going to respond to, what will move them, what will surprise them, what will make them laugh. I mean, notoriously, we talk about speaking English, or speaking Italian, or whatever language it is we're speaking, but actually we don't speak a single one. Any one of us in the course of an ordinary day does a lot of what linguists call code switching, which is just basically changing the register of your language according to who you're speaking to. And this will be something that writers do as well. So I know if I'm writing a piece for a tabloid newspaper, which I sometimes do, I'm going to use simpler language. I'm going to use a sort of certain phrases that will make it kind of a bit exaggerated and more exciting and more simplistic. If I'm writing for the Times Literary Supplement or an academic publication, I mean, I don't very often write for very academic publications because I'm a pretty middle-brow journalist, but if I'm writing for an academic publication, I will think, okay, they're going to expect more sort of more detachment, less exaggeration, less color. Probably the humor is going to be drier. I mean, I hope there's always humor, because humor is very powerful. Anything. I think so. That's number one. Number two, because this is a book about correctness, is, I do think, as much as I'm not a sort of prescriptivist pedant who thinks that, there's only one way of doing things, I think being aware that in formal situations, which is most writing situations, your audience is going to expect, this flows from the first principle, your audience is going to expect a certain level of formality, and that normally means a kind of standard English or standard Italian approach. You're going to use less slang, you're going to make sure you punctuate it correctly, all those really tedious nuts and boltsy things, but they're worth doing, particularly if you're in a persuasive situation where you're trying to get something out of that audience. I mean, as anyone, I work as a journalist, so I get a lot of press releases, but perhaps you work in an office and you are getting people's curriculum vitae, people applying for jobs and so on, or whatever it is, when it's so easy to just bin something when it arrives and it is badly punctuated or badly spelt or badly laid out, or any of those things that make you think, oh, this person either doesn't know what they're doing or can't be bothered to do it right. So getting it right is important in those contexts. I mean, if you're writing an email to your friends, it doesn't matter how you punctuate it. And often, like on social media, on Twitter, You don't need to use capital letters at the beginning of sentences. You can use a comma to run on. You can do what you like. So being correct. And the other thing I tend to say is a third thing, you asked for three, is try and be concise, because you're always trying to avoid giving people who are reading it. We live in an attention economy. We live in a space where you're competing for attention with everything else, up to and including and probably especially like Candy Crush Saga. So if you produce something that is overlong, that's windy, that uses 3 paragraphs, that's always this, if you've got an audience of 100, you lose one every paragraph, and you'll lose 2 or 3, per paragraph. The paragraph's too long to, if you say the same thing 3 different ways in 3 different things, say it once the best way rather than kind of having lots of tries. So edit yourself, be ruthless, and be short and engaging. I think that was a very long concise.
Well, actually, it was very interesting, refreshing, because normally we hear, normally the advice we get is to write, I don't know, 2 pages a day, and then edit everything following a strict criterion or methodology. And I was just wondering what you thought about the editing process, because when one writes a book, the hardest part is always the editing. I mean, you have to cut everything, you have to change things. I was just wondering, what's your take on this?
Well, I don't know. I actually quite enjoy the editing process, because for me, it depends what sort of thing you're writing. Most of what I do is journalism, and my books are sort of, they're kind of only pretend books, because really they're collections of little essay type pieces shunted together. I find it's very, for me, the hardest thing is getting the stuff down to start with. I mean, you kind of, attack it. And once you've got something on the page to play with, I find it much easier. But the greatest kind of advice, I think, for editing, or the most helpful thing I find, you can't always do it, but if you've got a bit of time, you can, is just leave it for a bit. Because what tends to happen, I think, is that when you've been working on a piece for a long time, or a book or a chapter or an essay or whatever it is, you'll find, you kind of know where you've taken this paragraph there, and that bit was awkward and that bit was difficult. And it's like Frankenstein's monster. You can see all the stitches and the staple marks and the scars and so it doesn't, you're so aware of how you put it together. You can't really read it as a reader would. And if you stick it in the bottom drawer, that apocryphal bottom drawer that all writers have, or, away from your desk for a bit, and go away, have a walk, take a couple of days, play World of Warcraft for, 36 hours, do whatever kind of floats your boat. When you come back to it, you'll find partly your unconscious will have done some work on it. And the bits that you weren't sure about, but were kind of wedded to, you'll suddenly be able to step back and you'll go like, yeah, I really like that bit, and I shouldn't have, because it's crap, and I'll take it out now. And you find it much easier to be objective about it, and you come back much refreshed. It's easier if you've left it in the freezer for a few days. Absolutely, undeniably, I think. Of course, if you're like me and you are, journalistic in your way of working, you only ever do stuff right up until the deadline, you may find you have very little time to edit at all. But if you can do things in advance and you have that self-discipline, I salute you, and then you'll find it much easier if you take a break.
Our next question is, let's see. It's on chapter 6 of your book. So, bells and whistles, bringing things to life. And it's on cadence or cadence.
Yeah.
And we were just wondering how you put that into action in your book, or how you applied it.
How do I like? I mean, I think as I wrote in the book, I think cadence is something that's very hard to talk about normally, because prose doesn't scan in the way that formal poetry does, but it's massively important. And I think it's the good writing is writing that sounds good. It's very hard to quantify in any meaningful way. I don't tend to read stuff out loud as I write it. I know it's very helpful to a lot of people to do that, and I'd advise it. I mean, I think I've been doing it long enough, and that I sort of have an internal, I sort of hear it mentally quite easily. So I'd like to be able to say, oh, every sentence I make, I read out. But I'm very aware of if something sounds right. I mean, I think part of that's practice, but we've all got it to an extent, but it can help. It becomes much plainer when you read it aloud. But it is to do with just sort of knowing, is this sentence sounding, is it sort of snaking? Is it taking too long to get to the key bit? Is it, does it sort of sound flat? And again, there isn't a kind of tick box way of doing it, but reading it out can help, because it sort of just makes it much starker. I mean, if you write a really bad long sentence, you'll find you can't read it aloud without really struggling. But yeah, cadence, I'm afraid, I think is hugely important. It's hugely hard to say anything kind of formal about. But again, sentence length goes into that. You can write beautifully cadenced, incredibly long sentences, but it's really hard to do, and people won't thank you for it.
One thing that seems to have surprised us quite a bit, or at least one of my friends, is that you don't have a part where you say adverbs are bad. Because most of the books books on writing, or books that try to teach you how to write, always say recheck your adverbs hundreds of times, check that a lot, try to make sure it's a bit lighter. I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the adverb school of thought, which is one of those kind of quite standard pieces of writing advice, along with never use the passive. It seems to me that that's basically bullshit. I mean, if the good Lord had not meant us to have adverbs, he wouldn't have given us adverbs. They obviously have a function in language. They are useful. I think a presumption against using them automatically is a good one, because partly to do with cadence, you're cluttering up the sentence, that's more syllables. And because we have a lot of expressive verbs that will do the work of adverbs. But it doesn't mean, you have to sort of perversely hasten. In and of themselves, adverbs need to be discarded. I mean, yeah, if you can get away without using them, don't use them, in the same way that you don't need too many adjectives, ideally, if you've chosen your noun right. But sometimes you do need to say, do this quickly, or, I mean, and you could say, not, come here quickly, or hasten here, hurry here. But sometimes the cadence will want an adverb, and sometimes, the adverb's doing useful work. I mean, adverbs have a semantic freight. They say something. They qualify verbs in the same way that, it's weird to me that we don't get this idea that adjectives are all in and of themselves bad, but adverbs survive and adjectives are fine, because we have nouns that have some of the expressive weight of certain adjectives, just as we have verbs that have some of the expressive weight of certain adverbs. But they exist. They exist, and they're there for a reason. And I have no objection to using adverbs at all. Like lots of these things, and I do try and say in the book, there exist a whole sort of rule, sort of like canon of like zombie grammar rules, which aren't really rules at all, or zombie bits of writing advice, never start with the weather, or never have anyone say, never introduce direct speech with anything other than the word said, which lots of writers cleave to, and I don't see why not. Why don't people sometimes shout or squeak or exclaim or whatever? I mean, I think what they move in the right, they're pointing in the right direction, in that elaborating endlessly for the sake of it, putting too much in, over-colouring your language is a bad thing. You don't want to be drawing attention to yourself, but often you need an adverb. So yeah, hooray for adverbs. I use them freely.
Our next question is a bit more, it's an easier question, let's put it that way. So it's, what was your favorite part of the book? And how did you start writing this book?
What's my favorite part of the book? I think I enjoyed talking about, I enjoyed the chapter on cadence because I think it's not enough discussed, and because it was an opportunity for me to be rude about my friend Giles Corran, which was very nice because he came to the launch party and I said, "You're in the book." And I then got this kind of email from him about a week later saying, "You utter bastard, you backstabbed me." But because it had bugged me for about 15 years that he was wrong about that point of cadence. I also enjoyed writing a section, which I don't think ended up in the final book, actually, which was Orwell's rules of writing, which people often hold up. Are you aware of these rules? That in his famous essay, Politics in the English Language, George Orwell wrote a list of 10 rules for writing English. And they are almost all of them kind of nonsense. And they're also, many of them he contradicts himself. He's one of those people who says, never use the passive voice. And actually, that entire essay has about twice as much instance of the passive voice as the average in the language. And anyway, it was fun going through them one by one, saying, well, this is wrong, and this is why this is, because it's one of those things that, again, a lot of people, you know, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, will say, well, as Orwell said, you know, in his rules for writing. But in the end, I didn't want to look petty, so I took that out. But the book came about, I'd like to say it was some sort of personal inspiration. It was my publisher, actually, who had published the book about rhetoric and said, I think you should write a book about language and usage. And I said, well, yeah, but I said with the kind of burst of humility, I was like, there's dozens and dozens of books like that, because there really are. I mean, I don't know whether there are quite as many in Italian as there are in English, but it's a sort of big thing. And I said, and they're all written by pig ignorant journalists who think they know how the language works, but have no real linguistic understanding. And he said, yes, and you can do the same thing. But what I wanted to do was try and do something that didn't pretend to be an academic linguist's approach, and I did. I've got on the shelf behind me. Is it visible? Yes, look here. The Cambridge Grammar of the English Language. It's this book about that thick, and it cost me a small fortune, even secondhand. And I used that as a reference, so that I hope that, as far as the linguistics go, because I've got huge respect for proper linguists, I would sort of say that, okay, I think this is how this works. And I'd then go and check and try and reconcile the proper grammar account with what I was writing in my jokey journalistic way. And then when I could understand what the linguists are saying, that seems to have been right. So I hope the book's academically respectable. But my idea was really just to say, look, this is how I do it. This is what the professionals say, and this is why it's okay to do it this way. So it's kind of, it is a follow-on in a way from the rhetoric book, because it's about how you use language to a purpose rather than claiming to be a kind of totalizing guide to style.
We always invite professors, so we always ask this other question, which is, what is the best advice you've ever gotten? And in this case, it would be on writing. So people always have that piece of advice that they remember, and they always talk about, well, what's the best piece of advice you've gotten?
Best piece of advice? Well, I don't think I've been given personal advice that's stuck with me, but there is it's a Counsel of Perfection for Journalism. And I think it was S.J. Perelman, the New Yorker writer, who said the key to being good at journalism is you have to be better than the people who are quicker than you and quicker than the people who are better than you. Which I think is it applies particularly to journalism, because that's a quick thing. But that sort of idea that you're not trying to write The Great Gatsby, you're trying to do something that's as good as it can possibly be and on time. And that's certainly a Counsel of Perfection in my narrow and limited world. I think the other piece of advice that I've cherished is Kingsley Amis's, where he said that 90% of writing is about applying the seat of your trousers to the seat of your chair, which is to say that it's no use, wandering around thinking, waiting for inspiration to strike. If you sit there and just crank out the words and it goes back to what I was saying about editing, get something down on the paper, then you can fix it. But if you don't get anything down on the paper in the first place, you're going nowhere. You need to actually just get on with it. And often it's boring and there's always something you'd rather be doing, but you know, you got to do it.
Well,
you're still mute.
Yeah, now I'm not. Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I think our 20 minutes is over.
Oh, well,
and all right. Thank you, and perhaps if you could, we would love to invite you for your other book as well, if you've got time.
Well, thank you. I'm always happy people are reading my books, and it's a great honor and privilege to have people doing it. So thank you again for having me. And
thank you so much.
See you soon.
See you soon. Bye. Thanks.